Hi all, I have another amazing game of the legend Bobby Fischer to show you against Uzi Geller, not Efim Geller, who was one of Fischer's black sheep. Geller had a very good record against Fischer, Efim Geller, but this is Uzi Geller. But Uzi Geller is a strong player in his own right, an Israeli chess master. He was Israeli champion in 1971-72. He tied 7th to 10th in Netanya 1968. And other great achievements. So he's played in the Olympiads, etc. So let's have a look at this game. Fischer playing white played e4. So this is Netanya 1968. We have Uzi Geller playing the French defense, and we have d3, the sign of the King's Engine attack system. So this is inspired by a chessball course. You can see a bit.ly link for a free version, 2 hours of content if you follow that bit.ly link about the King's Engine attack if you want to use it. But more on that later. Let's look at this game now. So d5, knight d2, c5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, knight gf3, both sides castle, knight c6, rook e1, queen c7. And now this is a very important committal decision which you need to time this correctly, see if it works in all cases. If you're going to commit a pawn to e5, Fischer does so. He doesn't touch his queenside pawns. There might have been a temptation for some players to play c3. He tries to keep these queenside pawns fairly intact and solid. If black wants to try and undermine the pawn structure later, then black can try that, but white in the meantime can try and build around the e5 point and try and generally get a good kingside attack going. We see here queen e2, b5, so black is being very aggressive on the queen side. White now plays h4. This is 2 or 3 purposes to this move. In the short term it might be preventing moves like g5 from white. You can imagine if the knight goes here and the bishop goes here, you don't want g5 to be a resource. Additionally, the pawn might be supporting a dark square campaign to weaken dark squares in black's camp with h5 and h6. And if black ever plays g6, then the option of hg. So it's multi-purpose move, this h4. And it also means if the knight hops to h2, that's going to be useful as well, using the h2 square vacated by the pawn to come to g4. So this whole King's Engine concept is one which really I found fascinating, and you can see this in Fischer's King's Engine defense games as well, the same kind of overprotection strategy of the e5 point. I think this is a very key thing of interest to the system, and has scored me many wins using this same plan in both my over the board games and online games. And to me it also alludes to the strong point strategy, the e5 strong point, which Nimzowitsch has sometimes called overprotecting a central square. In particular, e5 was the most favourite square in Nimzowitschian examples of overprotection. So your pieces put a lot of force behind this to stop moves like f6 even being playable sometimes, because there's pressure behind that, e6 might be lost, etc. So it's a very interesting King's Engine attack or King's Engine defense strategy in reverse, which Fischer has employed to great success. a5, we have knight f1. Now, if c3 here, just to give some example, this does give a target. b4, this could get unpleasant, this alignment against the queen. And if black can get to play some undermining, even if white gets a strong attack later, with the pressure on the pawn chain, black might be able to do some sort of piece set later. For example, like this, getting 2 connected passed pawns, which is the sort of thing neural networks would do, and get a big advantage with the 2 connected passed pawns. So committing the pawns is asking for a bit of trouble quite often. So it doesn't touch these pawns. Knight f1, and it invites, though, what seems to be a very tempting move. By not playing c3, there's an open invitation for knight d4, which is played with tempo, hitting the queen. So has black got a really big point here? Because isn't this pawn going to be the backward pawn in this structure if white took? Well, let's examine if d4, this might be interesting as well. Black should be fine in these lines. It seems technically black is going to be about even in these ferocious sharp lines. Yeah, it should be about even actually. So d4 was a palatable alternative as well. There's a few actually. h6 or b4 also seem to lead to even positions on my analysis of this. So knight d4 represents a very, very committal decision by black. Although it promises to expose the c2 pawn with fast pressure, the way black plays it, which is very, very interesting in its own right. There are some nuances about this position. The queen, although it was designed for c2, is also, there's a slight shadow about its placement, a dark side, that it actually runs into bishop f4, which is a kind of piece alignment, a tactical signal we need to be wary of when our king or queen, it can be aligned even through a pawn. It can be tactically dangerous. So there's that, and also the bigger aspect of this, white does take, leaving black with these double pawns. If white can ever collect this d pawn, then this c8 bishop is questionable in endgames, especially if the dark square bishops can be exchanged off, and you can imagine a knight versus bishop endgame being bad, but this pawn could be a liability later. We see this subtle alignment, which is dangerous for black in principle, and black really needs to watch out for tactics now all the time, like bishop takes d5 for e6. At the moment, this kind of thing is not that effectual. We have rook a6, which is a very, very fast way to build pressure on c2. So has black got a point? And also d3 will be another target for this bishop to come to a6. So we see knight h2, rook c6, white defends, bishop a6. And it seems as though black is building up potentially a huge formidable pressure on the pawn c2 pawn with rook c8 coming. So Fischer needs a strong move here, and I wonder if you can guess what Fischer plays, because black is building up, bringing the pressure on the poor backward pawn. Can Fischer be the hero to the backward pawn here? Can he salvage this situation? The pawn, it can't be moved forward. There's a lot of pressure because of that d pawn. What does Fischer do? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video. Okay, the heroic move, bishop takes d5. The c2 pawn needs a hero here, and this must be it to disrupt black completely with this tactic. It gives up the light square bishop though. This is not something you would do ordinarily, but in this situation it's really worth it. We see e takes d5. An alternative, if rook c5, then the bishop just goes to e4, and this position, knight f3, hitting d4. So exchanges here with knight takes d4 favour white. So e takes d5, going into the line of fire, that alignment, e5 to e6, the pawn goes to e6, hitting the queen. We see queen d8. On bishop d6 as an alternative, then taking, and then e takes d7. This position, we can see, although the absence of the bishop, the knight comes to hit d4 now, and it will be protecting c2 after winning d4, so it will be sorting out that issue. So if here, this position, this type of position is going to be great for white. That bishop is never going to see the light of these light squares. It's never going to be able to expose these light squares in this structure. White's just significantly better there. So we see queen d8, e takes, and now rook e6. This is a very dangerous position. Clearly, if queen takes d7, white just takes there without penalty. And if bishop d6, can you see what white has in this position if that pawn's dared to be left on d7? If I give you 5 seconds, what would white play here? Okay, there's queen e8, very, very dangerous. That pawn is a pain here. So for example, taking it here, white's threatening d8, queening. So for example like this, taking, and then d8 is actually checkmate. So yeah, very, very dangerous. So rook e6, but now Fischer causes chaos in this position with queen g4. So now we have f5. It seems as though transitioning into endgames here is a bad idea indeed for black. If queen takes d7 instead, then rook takes, and say queen takes, and the queens come off. Bishop e5, bishop f6, knight f3. The knight versus bishop scenario in this endgame will be magnificent for white. That bishop, yeah, is not doing much, and the pawn could be collected protecting c2. White's going to have a big advantage there. In this line, by the way, instead of king f7, if bishop takes e5, then again white can just play like this, for example, come and protect if needed with the king c2 as well. But the knight's going to just pop back for dinner here without black being able to do much to win that d pawn. So this pawn is a real endgame liability. So we have f5, which does create more weaknesses and weakens black's king a bit. Queen h5, that pawn's collected. So was it worth it for white to give up the light square bishop? Knight f3. So there are immediate big threats here, like taking on d4 could be one of them. We have g6. If rook g6 here, then there's actually knight e5 forking queen and rook. If rook takes e1, rook takes e1, g6, queen h6, bishop f6, there's bishop e5 here, and taking off the dark square bishops gets to this nightmare endgame where d4 is weak, but also black is under pressure on the king side as well. It's a nightmare for black. So we have g6, queen h6, bishop f6, and now rook takes e6, queen takes e6, and now this really shows Fischer's tactical alertness for resources from black. White to play, guess what Fischer plays, which might not be the most natural move in the world that you'd think of. If I give you 5 seconds here, a real genius move. Things are not so simple to exploit, even seemingly good positions, for particular reasons. Fischer is very good not just at looking at loose pieces, but also trappable pieces, perhaps any form of awkward piece. I think he's on it like a hawk with his calculations, even at this point in his career, 1968, because he doesn't play a certain move, which maybe we'd be really tempted to as club players to play. So I wonder if you can guess what move he did play. 5 seconds starting from now. It's absolute genius. He plays bishop e5. Believe it or not, if he plays rook e1, guess what black has here? If you may have seen this, queen takes, very forcing for bishop g7, and this queen can be perpetually attacked like this. Queen h6, bishop g7. If white wants to bail out, the only way is bishop d6. Okay, fine, but we end up with a kind of position which is a little bit only a small edge for white. Yeah, it's going to be a bit tricky here. So either that repetition or this endgame. So okay, bishop e5 though really does go into a kind of Alpha Zero style position where this c8 bishop is being victimized. The favorite strategy of Alpha Zero against Stockfish, to victimize the c8 bishop. We want to swap off the dark square bishops, and Fischer gets this with this temporary piece sack for rook e1, that pin piece. So getting this knight versus bishop endgame by force is absolute genius, the way it's been done. So f4, this is very desperate now. Rook takes e5, and now playing into black's king side with h5, not worrying about fg or this knight being attacked. So we have fg, hg. Yeah, it's far too dangerous to play rook takes f3 here. Let's see this position. If rook takes f3, what could white play here which you think is dangerous? There's all sorts of things, but the major thing is rook e8 surely. So there's no rook f8, and if here, this is devastating. This would be absolutely devastating. So no problem with f3 it seems. And if hg, queen g6, queen e6, there's rook g5 there. So yeah, Fischer's not worried about the f3 knight being a bit loose. So fg, he plays hg. We have g takes f2, king takes hg. Here, if queen g7, then g takes, queen takes, rook e7 check, rook a7, that victimized bishop comes in. And here, white's just absolutely got a massive position. And in that line, instead of bishop c8, if rook f6, king g3, unpinning. Again, massive position, knight versus bishop endgames. here. So we have hg, queen takes g6, which does look at the a6 bishop. It's actually not taken here. That would be silly actually, because there's a pinned knight. Maybe queen takes e5 is an issue. But in fact, Fischer just plays, yeah, let's put that on the board. There's a pinned knight, so either rook takes f8 or just this. But Fischer plays a crushing move instead here, simple and strong. Can you guess Fischer's move in this position? If I give you 5 seconds. Okay, rook g5, and the game ended here. That bishop is still an issue, so it's kind of, there's a double attack on g7 and a6 which persists here. If the game continued, say queen takes, then taking the bishop. But otherwise, if the queen isn't taken, if rook f7, then the queen is pinned with queen h6, winning the queen. Massive advantage. So yeah, a crushing win here with the King's Engine attack. Black played a really radical plan to really quickly establish pressure, trying to quickly establish pressure on c2, only to run into this bishop takes d5 tactic, which created all sorts of disruptions and possibilities of getting very advantageous endgames, where this knight would be dominating the bishop quite often after picking up d4, which was a slight downside of this whole strategy. But yeah, the tactical alignment, bishop f4, sometimes the queen really doesn't belong on c7, given this like tactical idea of bishop f4. So very interesting aspects of the King's Engine attack can be seen from these examples. I think it's our duty, if we're going to play the King's Engine attack, to look in great detail at these examples and extract all the principles we can to make sure they've got maximum coverage when we do play the King's Engine attack. That's why I wanted to go into great detail on this. And he's also played the King's Engine attack against the Caro-Kann a lot, and also, of course, he plays the defense as black at this point in the career quite a lot, King's Engine defense. So the common reusable strategies are very important to Fischer in his escalation to be winning championships, etc., even by the time he's like 16. Funny. So anyway, in the next stage of this video, we're going to check out this course, which there's a short and sweet version of the King's Engine attack course, which has 2 hours of free content. This bit.ly link, we're going to investigate that now in the next part of this video. So bear with me, and I'll be back in a bit with a different t-shirt. Hi all, as mentioned, you're in for a treat. There's actually a free version of the King's Engine attack. There's 2 hours of free content here. There's already nearly 700 students on it, and it hasn't even been officially released at the time of checking it out. So it's something to dive in, check out the 2 hours of free content and the core lines. So 2 hours, 26 core lines. I've made some notes on some of the ones which I have some passionate agreement with. So this King's Engine attack system is a way of coping with all the modern theory, all the complexity of modern theory. If you're struggling or drowning in opening lines and want to learn just a good system with white that you can play against all the major systems like the French defense, the Caro-Kann, the Sicilian, and even e5, then this is for you. This is what Fischer used early in his career. It's approved by one of our world champions. So easy to learn, very few forced lines, king safety guaranteed, but not for the opponent, because you can often attack them on the king side with the e5 outpost pawn stronghold, and it's hard to go wrong. It's harder, you know, if you make an inaccuracy, you're not going to be totally blown away necessarily, so you can still carry on. And it's great for even like speed chess. You can often do quite a lot of pre-moves because it's a simple system. Basically, you know what you're doing with it. You don't have to always look in detail at the opponent's move. So with that said, let's have a look at some of the notes that I've made that I really want to talk about. The first one, so of these core lines, is this one. So the b6 French. There's a fantastic idea here, which is stunning. So in this French defense, as Fischer played it against the French defense, we have this line, bishop g2, d takes, knight takes. So that's very, very interesting, because you might routinely be thinking d takes e4. But that, in this particular position, you know, black wants the bishop on this diagonal sometimes. So bishop b7, bishop f4, bishop e7. Now, instead of routinely castling here, there's a great recommendation instead. Often the sign of the top grandmasters, they don't play stereotypically. They sometimes play even more effective moves. They know when to break the rules. Knight e5. And the point here, after knight takes e5, bishop takes, is that black is having trouble castling, because there's ideas of even knight f6 and taking on b7. So king f8 is a very sad necessity, as it's mentioned. And if black tries to play aggressively like this, there's a really amazing idea. It looks as though white's going into a self-pin now, but there's this sublime idea I would have never thought of, I think, which is this move bishop f3. And the thing is, there is a subtle tactical alignment of the rook and king here, which means that, in fact, after f takes, bishop takes, this alignment could be celebrated with f5, trying to rip open that king. And say this position, it gets really quite nasty for black here with that pinned knight now. That's exploited with queen h5 threatening checkmate. And here, bishop d6, and we have a beautiful finish coming up in this position. So after bishop d6, king g8, we have, yes, can you guess it without looking? A nice queen sack, queen e8 check, and yes, there's going to be rook f8 checkmate. So who would have thought? Bishop f3, key move here. I was shocked that these resources exist, but it's tempting. You know, it protects the bishop importantly, so it's kind of an unpinning resource and a kind of celebrating alignment resource all at once, because white can now retreat the knight to challenge the diagonal, but black might be, you know, tempted for this sort of stuff. So I thought that's a really, really cool thing to mention. Now here, there's also a couple of variations where the power of Fischer's A3 is celebrated. So Fischer made iconic usage of the system, and in fact his A3 is remarked on quite a bit in this course. So A3 is like a type 1 committal decision. Pawns don't go backwards, so your pawn moves in this system are crucial. You want to know when you don't play e5. You want to know when you touch your queen side. So here's c3 in this particular variation, but now a3, very interesting. And here it's got a really a fantastic usage. If black plays a5, then you pounce like you would quite often in the King's Indian with a5. This is a similar trick if you play the King's Indian defense, to sort of pretend as though you're going to be playing b5 and then play a5. You get this b5 square, and the knight hasn't committed to f1 yet, so can actually switch to the queen side later, you know, b1, a3, b5, and you get a nice positional advantage, because black with c5 and a5 is not in a great position. That is a big gaping hole now, that b5 pawn. So I thought that was quite interesting. And here's another sort of type 1 decision, pawn moves in particular. Because pawns don't go backwards, I want to sort of reinforce these particular notes I made, because they're really about the pawn moves, when and where you want to make them. If we go into this line, so the committal pawn moves, important to get them right. So rook e1, bishop b7. Now, black has not committed to castling. Now this is a very, very committal decision, because black even hasn't made the commitment to castling. This e5 wedge is often much better once black's castled kingside, because then you reinforce e5 and you've got all sorts of dark square plans like h4, h5, h6, bringing the knight. But that doesn't, it's not as effective if black's going to castle queenside. So what you do is a3 here, waiting. So very important not to play e5 here. This is spelled out. If you get your pawn moves right, you'll feel the real pleasure and the effectiveness of the King's Indian attack without its downsides. Because if you did play e5, black's later got things like castling and g5, g4 land, h5. It could be quite vicious. c3. Now if black persists with casting queenside here, you're in a race situation, but you're better equipped for this race. You can play b takes, and look at this, knight b3, e takes, opening up the center is useful, and you've got a huge advantage. You can play c4 here, yeah, black's king is less safe than yours. Their attack hasn't got started. And also, you've got mechanisms now for knight d4 as well. You've got safe use of d4 in this position. If over g4, this is not really going to open lines to your king. So, yeah, there's all sorts of things. c4, d4, d5 is mentioned here. So that's the discussion of these committal pawn moves is vital to understanding this particular repertoire. That's the real, if there was a cost to this repertoire of trying to cope with all the modern technical theory, is that you've got to get your type 1 pawn move decisions correct. And it really does emphasize, the author does really emphasize the key ideas of when to play certain pawn moves and when not to. Now here, I've got a nice trap noted here. So there's a nice trap here. Let's rewind. So e4, we have c5, knight f3, knight c6, d3, g6, g3, bishop g7. So we get this position. Let's carry on there for the moment. And black gives up the light square bishop. So does this have a downside to it? Are the light squares potentially weak in black's camp? The queen is taking here, because one of the heroes of the repertoire, a grandmaster, Bassi, plays this way, takes with the queen and drops the queen back, and sets a little trap for black, which is quite remarkable actually, that you'd think b5 here is playable, but actually it falls victim after a takes to e5, believe it or not. And you might think, well, hold on, black can just take that, surely. No? Can't black take the pawn here? It's not losing a piece. But the thing is, it is losing a piece, because f4, the knight hasn't got g4, can't go back to c6. And the same story with the other one. If the other one plays, then you play f4, the knight goes back and you take on c6. Black is losing, not necessarily losing a piece, but if it has to endure ed, then it's going to be a big advantage for white. It's opening up the bishop pair. So black can't really take on e5 at all, and has to wait for white to take on d6, which opens up the bishop pair with great advantage. So I thought that was very, very interesting when you get the light square bishop. A lot of fun from your point of view. Okay, so here is another non-stereotypical example where you wouldn't play stereotypically. So let's have a look at this. So e4, we go into this line of Sicilian, and now queen e2. So black is committed to d5. They spent the time to play e6 and d5, and it's here queen e2, because actually, let's have a look why this queen e2 would be useful. It's because this pawn chain should be hit hard. It's been taken time for black to construct it, so you hit it hard with c4 in this position, and this resulting position here is really nice for white. If you look at this, there's really nice pressure, and knight d5, this alignment is a crushing move, and a lot of players with black perhaps they don't want a castle kingside, because it seems like a ready-made attack with h4 and knight g5 quite often. At some point knight's ready to pop in to the dark squares, but if black castles queenside, there's knight d5, and this has seen quite a few victims with the black pieces. So there's a model game to check out there. But basically white gets a really crushing position after knight d5. Let's check it out. Let's check it out, what happened there. The carnage. So cd, so this is Kozenko, a strong grandmaster. White played like this. Look at the pressure on e6. f3. And after knight f7, white is winning material here, and there's no problem. After queen takes f3, we just snap off the bishop to avoid being made. We've got all our material up. So Kozenko smashed to pieces in that line with trying to castle queenside. Yeah, falls victim to knight d5, like we saw in the Fischer game actually. This tactical alignment of a bishop on f4 and a queen on c7 is something to look out tactically for, like Fischer did way back in the 60s. It's still happening time and time again, tactical alignment when you have bishop f4 as a move. So great stuff. So I hope you check out this. This is 2 hours of video, but also the core lines which he painfully distilled into these. He didn't want to take any out. I've been through the whole 2 hours yesterday. I wanted to get a thorough overview of this for my own games, because often I do want a system without too much opening theory, especially a great coper. Sometimes when you're tired, you don't want something too technical and too tactically precise. So this is a great fallback option. You might have other systems with white as well, but this is a great one sometimes to spring out the King's Engine attack. It's literally actually a coiled spring, sometimes referred to as a coiled spring setup, because it's got latent energy within it that you're springing out later. But especially if you're a King's Engine defense player, a lot of the ideas are just ideas in reverse, and the King's Engine defense is one of my favorite openings ever, with the black pieces against 1d4. But here, the attack version has got a lot of great stuff going for it, as you can imagine. Okay, I hope you check it out, that bit.ly link, and may it improve your chess and your understanding, especially of type 1 pawn moves, committal pawn moves. They're very important to understand in this type of positional repertoire. Okay, thanks very much.